The chamber is open and full of whispers.
Before we dive in, check the link in the description if you want exclusive Timelines members-only videos you won't find on YouTube, all on our Patreon. 13 years after the Ministry of Magic filed death certificates for James and Lily Potter, their son walked onto platform 9 3/4 to catch the Hogwarts Express. His sister was beside him. His parents were 3 steps behind. The Ministry had made a great many errors over those 13 years. Bureaucratic ones, strategic ones, moral ones that would take years of reform to address. But this was the one they never saw coming. What follows is the story of how it happened. Start, as all stories about the Potters must, in Godric's Hollow, on the night everyone was wrong. The wrongness arrived before the thought did. Sirius Black stood at his kitchen window, tea cooling in his hands, watching rain drag itself down the glass. He did not know, for 2 full seconds, why his chest had locked. Then he did know, and he did not want to, and his hands opened, and the mug hit the floor, and he was already running. Peter. The way Peter had held his left arm against his body when he laughed, 3 days ago, like a man protecting something underneath. The cold flash of inventory in his eyes when Sirius had reached across the table for bread. Not guilt. Calculation. The look of a man taking stock of a room he was about to leave permanently. Padfoot hit the street at full sprint. A dog moves through a city differently than a man does. Lower, faster, reading shadow and geometry with a precision no human body allows. 6 blocks went under before Sirius permitted himself the word he'd been outrunning. Betrayal. He flewed from the back room of a pub on Nocturne's edge, jamming powder into the flames with hands that weren't quite steady, and spoke the village green. Not the cottage, never the cottage. Because the marauders had survived a war by arriving at their destinations from 100 yards out, and old habits were the only kind worth keeping. James Potter was in the kitchen feeding Harry when Sirius came through the door. Harry had porridge on his chin. He was 15 months old and deeply pleased about this fact. "Peter," Sirius said. Peter gave them the address. Tonight, James set the spoon down very carefully. What followed moved at the double speed of crisis, the world contracting to a list of tasks and the order they needed doing. Lily was already in the nursery when James reached the landing. She had not needed to be told. She had felt it through some channel Sirius couldn't name, and James had long since stopped trying to explain. And she was pulling books from the shelf above Harry's crib, with the focused efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this night, longer than she'd admitted to anyone. "I have something," she said without turning. James looked at the spines. Old magic, pre-ministry magic, the kind Remus had spent years making all of them read until they knew it the way they knew their own names. His face did something complicated. The expression of a man who loves someone enough to hate that they're right. "Tell me," he said. She told him. He listened without interrupting, and then he helped her build it. Below them, Sirius moved through the ground floor in silence, wand loose in his hand, jaw set in the way it set when he was deciding not to feel something until later. Harry watched from his seat, batting contentedly at golden snitches James had charmed to orbit his head like small bright planets. Voldemort did not knock. He spoke the address and the Fidelius shattered. Peter had given him everything, syllable by syllable, the complete surrender of a man who had already chosen, and the cottage door swung open from the inside. James and Sirius were waiting on the other side of it. The duel that followed was not elegant. It was violent and close and brutal. The work of 2 men who had spent their 20s learning exactly how much damage a human body can absorb and exactly how to make another body stop. The entrance hall cracked. A window dissolved into sparks. A section of ceiling came down between one breath and the next, and James vaulted it without slowing, driving Voldemort backward with a combat transfiguration sequence that turned falling plaster into a wall of pressurized stone. Voldemort was not weak. Let no account of this night suggest otherwise. He was a force wearing a human face, and the house shook around him the way houses shake in real storms. Not because the structure was fragile, but because the storm was genuine. But James Potter had been preparing for this moment for years, and Sirius Black was fighting for the only family he had ever truly had. And they were not fighting to win. They were fighting to buy Lily 40 seconds. They got 38. Voldemort broke through to the stairs. He reached the nursery. The door opened under his word, and he stood in the doorway looking at a woman who was not begging, not cowering, not moving aside. Lily Potter stood between her son and the door, and she was smiling. "You've already lost," she said. The green light crossed the room. It met the ward she had built from her own blood and her own deliberate choice. Not sacrifice as accident, but as architecture, as the old books described. A structure requiring intent, not death, to stand. The ward did not absorb the curse. It answered it. The sound was not an explosion. It was deeper. The resonant toll of something fundamental being decided. A bell struck at the frequency of consequence. The windows blew outward. The floor cracked along its entire length. And what had called itself the Dark Lord came apart at its own seams. The body dissolving, the will scattering into the October dark like smoke from a fire that had finally gone out. Harry was crying. Lily was laughing and crying simultaneously. Harry pressed against her chest, her knees on the cracked floor, her hands shaking for the first and last time that night. The shockwave from the blood anchor's release moved through the nursery like a tide. She turned Harry at the last moment, taking the worst of it across her own body, letting only its diminished edge graze his forehead. He would carry the scar it left for the rest of his life. She would carry the knowledge of how it got there. James came up the stairs 3 at a time and held them both. Sirius found them like that. He stood in the doorway of the ruined nursery for a moment he would never describe to anyone, and then he came in and sat on the floor with his back against the crib and his eyes closed. "We have," he said to the ceiling, "approximately 6 hours before the ministry arrives." They moved to the kitchen. Harry fell asleep on Lily's chest between one breath and the next. 3 adults sat around the table in the wreckage of the night and made the decision with the cold clarity that comes from having just survived something unsurvivable. Dumbledore would want the boy. They had seen how he operated, with genuine love and with the calculation that love in a brilliant man does not preclude. They were not willing to gamble Harry's entire childhood on the margin between those two things. Beyond that, the network. Death Eaters still at large, former servants with nothing left to lose, a world that would produce statues and celebrations before it finished producing vengeance. A living Potter would become a target before the ink dried on the first front page. A dead Potter was something else entirely. By dawn, there were ruins in Godric's Hollow. Real ruins. Because the Blood Anchor's release had taken half the cottage, and what the magic left standing James and Sirius brought down themselves, carefully. With the precision of people constructing a story that needed to hold. 3 transfigured shapes lay in the rubble. The seals were good. They had been the best in their year, and they had spent a decade getting better. The Potters disapparated to Potter Manor. The world mourned. The Potters worked. Potter Manor was old in the way that mattered, not crumbling but settled, the stone carrying generations of magic the way old timber carries weather. The wards made a low, constant sound, almost like breathing. Harry's nursery was on the 2nd floor, east-facing, the window perfectly positioned to catch the morning. James recharmed the snitches by hand that first night. He sat beside the crib until dawn, watching them orbit his sleeping son's face. The Horcrux hunt began before Harry could walk. The diary was found and destroyed within the year, Sirius tracking its location through a network he was quietly building in the shadow of the outside world, moving in disguise, patient and precise. The ring was harder. The curse on it took Lily 4 months to unpick, and she did not sleep well during those 4 months, and James did not ask her to stop. The locket came from a cave during a dangerous expedition that left Sirius with 3 broken ribs, and a silence that meant he was not going to discuss the details. The cup followed. The diadem, which Remus tracked to a location in Scotland through 2 years of painstaking lore research, cross-referencing sources in 7 languages. Nagini remained a variable. Dumbledore's writing, available in the Potter Library, suggested she might have been made into a Horcrux only after Voldemort's first body was destroyed, using a murder committed during his years of Wraith existence. The Council tracked her separately, treated her as an open question rather than a confirmed entry, and marked her resolution as pending. 5 anchors confirmed and destroyed, 1 still requiring finding. Lily, meanwhile, had begun a 2nd line of research. Frank and Alice Longbottom were in the long-term ward of St. Mungo's Hospital, and they had been there since the autumn following Voldemort's fall, tortured into irreversibility by Bellatrix Lestrange and Bartemius Crouch Jr. in a search for information they didn't have. The medical community had declared their condition permanent. Lily was skeptical of declarations made without sufficient investigation. She began working on Cruciatus reversal theory in her 3rd year at the manor. In the hours after Harry was asleep, In the systematic way she approached anything she intended to solve rather than merely study. Progress was slow, then measurable, then real. By the time Harry and Hermione reached Hogwarts, Frank and Alice were in the early cautious stages of something that had not been considered possible. Neville Longbottom arrived at Hogwarts with his parents' photograph in his front pocket, and something in his posture that had never been there in the life where they were unreachable. It was Lily who found Hermione. She had been doing it quietly since Harry could toddle, walking into Muggle spaces with a lineage-reading charm disguised as adjusting her scarf, checking the magical signatures of children in playgrounds and libraries and at school gates, because a decade of Horcrux research had taught her how many gifted children existed entirely unprotected in the world. Most registered as a soft glow. A candle behind frosted glass, the girl in Camden blazed. It was a gray morning in early autumn. Lily stopped in the middle of a street market, a man with a vegetable cart telling her to move along, and she did not hear him. The girl was sitting on a low wall outside a newsagent's. She was 5 years old, or nearly, small, with thick dark hair and the careful posture of a child who had dressed herself with great precision, because no one else was paying attention to the task. She had a book open across her knees, and she was reading it with her whole face, in the way children read before they learn to perform the act for other people. Lily activated the lineage reading. The result hit her like stepping from a dark room into direct sunlight. She had used this charm on hundreds of children. This one didn't glow. It burned, organized at a level she had only ever seen in children from established magical families who had spent their lives passively absorbing ambient magic. And beneath the brightness, threaded through like a watermark held to light, something older, a resonance she recognized from the Potter Library, Dagworth Granger. One of the oldest potions lineages in Britain, dormant for 3 generations, expressing itself now in this child with the full accumulated force of everything it had been holding back. Lily sat on a bench across the street and did not move. In 45 minutes, the girl read over 100 pages. At the 20-minute mark, a small adjustment flickered through her aura, the signal of a precise mind correcting a mispronounced word privately, with no audience, because accuracy mattered even when no one was watching. At 38 minutes, an elderly woman stopped on the pavement and turned in a slow, uncertain circle of someone who cannot find their bearings. The girl looked up, assessed, climbed down from her wall, walked to the woman, asked a question, received an answer, walked the woman to the correct bus stop 4 streets away, returned, climbed back onto her wall, found her page without glancing at the cover, and resumed reading. She did not look around to see if anyone had noticed. It had simply not occurred to her to. Lily went home and did not sleep. "What's she like?" James asked. After midnight. She corrected her own pronunciation of exacerbate in her head. Lily said, "She's 5. James picked up his tea, set it down. "She'll get on with Harry then." He said the rest of it. The manners exposure. The variable of a child who couldn't hold a secret the way an adult could be bound to one. Lily let him finish. Then she said, "She is alone, James. Not lonely in the way children sometimes are. Alone in the way that means no one around her sees what she actually is." James was quiet for a long time. "Go meet the parents," he said finally. "Properly. We do this right." She went back 3 times before she knocked. The Grangers were rational people. She understood this within the first hour of watching their household, the organized calm of a family that trusted cause and effect and documented results. They were going to need the truth. Not a softened version, not a managed one. She knocked on a Tuesday evening and said, when the door opened, "I know this is going to sound completely impossible, but I need to tell you something about your daughter." They let her in. She suspected they had been waiting, with the patient dread of intelligent people, for an explanation that matched the evidence they had already accumulated. The clocks that reset themselves. The books that relocated. The afternoon their daughter had been upset about missing the end of a television program, and every clock in the house synchronized simultaneously, as though the universe were offering an apology. They listened for 2 hours. They asked excellent questions. They did not panic. At the end, Lily told them what she was offering, what it would cost, and that the choice was entirely theirs. The Grangers asked for a week. Lily gave them 10 days. The ritual took place in the Potter Manor library, on an afternoon when autumn came through the tall windows in long gold bars. Harry was 4 years old, and had been told he was meeting someone important. He sat cross-legged on the rug opposite a girl who was nearly 5, less than a year older than him, and watched her with the focused attention he reserved for things he found genuinely interesting. She was looking at the shelves, 5,000 volumes, floor to ceiling, 3 stories climbing into the shadows above, arranged by subject and cross-referenced by era, annotated in the margins by 4 generations of Potters who had apparently shared her conviction that an unexamined book was a personal failing. The composure she wore lasted approximately 8 seconds. Then something behind it shifted, quietly, at the edges, as though a door had been opened that she had forgotten she'd closed. Lily wove the heart knot between them, old magic requesting its answer not in words, but in warmth that moved through the chest, and waited. She had read the theory for years. She was not prepared for the sensation of it, the warmth spreading through her own chest as the magic gauged the room and found what it was looking for. Hermione considered the warmth for exactly 4 seconds. Then she said yes. Golden light came from both their hands at once, wound between them, and settled into place with a completeness that was not dramatic, but absolute. The feeling of something structurally necessary finally put where it belonged. Harry, with the particular gravity small children deploy for moments they understand are significant, said, "Hello, sister?" Hermione looked at him. The careful composure of a child who had learned not to expect things came undone, very quietly, at the edges. "Hello, Harry," she said. "Your pronunciation of sister is excellent." Lily walked her through the library afterward. 5,000 volumes. Floor to ceiling, 3 stories of shelves climbing into the shadows, annotated by generations of people who had apparently shared Hermione's conviction that an unexamined book was a personal failing. She watched the girl's face. The composure held for 8 seconds. Then Hermione pressed her face against Lily's side and said nothing. And Lily put an arm around her and said nothing either, because some things do not require language to be fully understood. The library had been waiting for her. She had been waiting for it. The first lesson Remus Lupin ever taught them was how to sit still. Not meditation, sitting still with intention, the difference between a mind waiting and a mind working. He ran it every morning for a month before teaching anything else. Harry at 4 fidgeted with the suffering of a child constitutionally opposed to the concept. Hermione, not yet 5, sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on Remus with an attention so complete he occasionally felt obligated to be saying something more worthy of it. "You are not learning spells," he told them on the first morning. "You are learning what magic is before you learn what it does. Most wizards never understand the difference." Hermione started her first journal that week. She filled it in 3 months. James found her another. The elder Futhark came next. Chalk on the library floor, Remus drawing each rune with the patience of a man who understood that foundations were the whole building. Hermione copied them into her journal with the careful hand of someone who grasped immediately that these were structures, not symbols, architecture, not alphabet. Harry learned them by making Sirius recite them as a game. "Fehu," Sirius said one afternoon, lying on his back in the garden while Harry sat on his chest. "Fehu, cattle, wealth, the thing you start with. Urus, raw strength, not the same as power. Difference?" Harry considered this with the gravity of a 5-year-old repeating something he'd heard James say and quietly decided was true. Power is what you do with strength. You can have one without the other. Sirius stared at the sky for a long moment. "Your father is going to be insufferable about you." "He already is," Lily said from the doorway, without looking up from her book. The dueling began the year Harry turned 5. James approached it with a gravity that had nothing performative about it. No speeches, no legacy talk, just the quiet focus of a man who had watched too many people die from hesitation and had decided his children would never hesitate. They learned stances before spells, distance management before offense, how to read a dueler's shoulders in the instant before the casting arm moved, the stillness that preceded a feint. Sirius was the sparring partner. He was not gentle. He was not cruel either, and there is a meaningful difference between the two. The first time Harry dodged a real stunner, Sirius throwing it at a third of speed but real consequence intact if it landed. Sirius whooped before he could manage it. The sound came out loud and unguarded, and James turned to examine something very interesting on the far wall of the dueling hall. "You're not being subtle," Lily told him. "I'm fine," James said. Hermione, already taking notes on her own footwork, "He's crying." "I am not." "You are," she confirmed, and returned to her notes. Wandless magic arrived sideways, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, the way important things often do. Hermione was in the library, reaching for a book just beyond comfortable reach, frustrated in the way that arrives when a thing you want is precisely the distance that makes effort feel insulting. She reached. The book came, not fell, came, crossing 8 inches of air in a smooth, unhurried arc, and settling into her hand as though it had simply been waiting for her to stop pretending she needed to climb. She stood very still, looked at the book, looked at the shelf. From the armchair behind her, "Told you." "Told me what?" "You said nothing." "I told Remus 2 weeks ago you'd do it first. He owes me 3 chocolate frog cards." Hermione set the book down, did it again deliberately, then summoned Harry's chocolate frog cards from his room on the floor above, and held them out with a look that suggested this was a perfectly reasonable demonstration of the concept. "Those are mine," Harry said. "It's a practical application," she said. Harry's Patronus came at 9. He stood in the dueling hall and cast it, and the silver mist gathered and rose. A stag, standing in the thin morning light, with the solid presence of something that had always existed and needed only to be called. James made a sound, brief, immediately controlled. "Dad," Harry said, watching the Patronus, "I can hear you." He's not fine," Sirius said, and put an arm around him. Hermione designed her first original spell at 10. She had been studying the stinging hex for a fortnight, not to use it, but to understand it, pulling apart the arithmetic framework at the level where magic stopped being gesture and became declarative logic. She found an inefficiency, then a gap where something additional could sit without disrupting the base architecture. She added a tracking signature. Remus read her notes and was quiet for a long time, then for another long time. Then, "How long did this take you?" 3 weeks for theory. 2 days for the written framework. An hour to test it. "Hermione, this is graduate-level arithmancy. The base spell is poorly constructed. Someone should have caught this 50 years ago." A pause. "I mean that respectfully." "No, you don't," Remus said. "No," she agreed. Remus taught them about people too, not as a formal lesson but as something woven into everything else. He had a gift for it, the particular attention of someone who had spent his life reading rooms because rooms had not always been safe, and he passed it on the way he passed on everything, quietly, without performance, through accumulated example. Harry learned to read shoulders. Hermione learned to read silences. Both of them learned to tell the difference between someone who was performing fine and someone who was actually fine, which turned out to be rarer and more useful than almost anything else they learned. The Horcrux work moved through these years like weather, present and consequential, not explained until the children were old enough to understand the explanation. They knew from the stairs. The Marauder Council met in the kitchen after they were supposed to be asleep, and the manor's acoustics were less private than the adults believed. By the time Harry was 8 and Hermione was 9, they had assembled a reasonably accurate picture of the whole: the diary gone early, the ring the year after, the locket from a dangerous cave expedition that Sirius had come back from, with 3 broken ribs and a silence that meant he was not going to discuss it. The cup, the diadem tracked to Scotland. 5 anchors confirmed destroyed. Nagini still uncertain, and the council tracking her with the careful patience of people who understood that an unconfirmed variable was still a variable. They did not ask questions they weren't supposed to ask yet. They stored what they gathered and waited. The last sparring bout happened 3 days before term. Harry and Hermione, 11 years old, against James and Sirius simultaneously. No rules stated, no conditions set. Just the 4 of them in the dueling hall at 7 in the morning, with early light coming through the high windows, and everyone understanding, without saying it, that this was the final examination of 9 years of work. They won. Not because James and Sirius let them. James had a bruised collarbone from a combat transfiguration sequence Harry had apparently designed specifically for him. 3 moves that exploited the precise way James weighted his left foot before a counter, and Sirius went down to a paired wandless stunner that Harry and Hermione threw simultaneously from opposite sides of the room. A move so precisely coordinated it had its own grammar, a shared dueling language built between themselves over years of sparring in the manor's halls, developed in the way that people who have trained together long enough develop things, without being taught it and without being able to fully explain it. Sirius was laughing before he hit the floor. James, disarmed, his wand spinning away across the stone, looked at his children standing over him in the early morning light. He opened his mouth, closed it. The expression on his face was not one thing but several, arriving simultaneously and none of them with a clean name. "That's my children," he said. What followed could not be called a duel or a lesson or any formal thing. It was four people colliding in the middle of a dueling hall with a force that had nothing martial about it. James's arms around both of them, Sirius crashing into the group from the side before anyone could object, Lily appearing in the doorway and being pulled in before she could manage a single word of protest. 9 years of the dark, 3 days until the light. The Hogwarts letters arrived in late summer with the anticlimactic punctuality of things planned for so long that their arrival feels like a formality. Harry read his once and set it down. Hermione read hers twice, which for her indicated sentiment. The council met that evening. The decision had been made in principle years ago. Now it was just execution. Full reveal. King's Cross Station. Not a quiet re-entry, not a managed announcement, not the careful optics Dumbledore would have designed if anyone had thought to ask him. A declaration. "The Ministry won't know what hit them," Sirius said, and he was grinning in the way he grinned when something had been building for a very long time and was finally allowed to land. "That," James said, "is precisely the plan." There was one more matter to address first. Sirius Black had been a fugitive in name for nearly 13 years. Never physically taken, never imprisoned, but Peter Pettigrew had laid a careful frame before he ran. An explosion in a Muggle street. 12 dead. Peter's own finger found in the debris to suggest his death at Sirius's hands. The Ministry had issued charges against Sirius Black before the dust had settled, and those charges had stood in the official record ever since. The documents James had been preparing for years were ready. They would deal with this alongside everything else when they surfaced. The platform was organized chaos. Trunks scraping stone, owls protesting their cages, 200 families simultaneously attempting farewell and composure, and not entirely managing either. Draco Malfoy held court near the engine in his robes, already performing. The Weasley family occupied the far end in a cheerful explosion of red hair. Neville Longbottom, steadier than anyone who hadn't watched him grow would have expected, grounded by something Frank and Alice's early recovery had given him that nothing else could, was pursuing an escaped toad with single-minded focus. The crowd at the barrier thinned in a wave, not from magic, from the involuntary response of human bodies encountering something they had categorized as impossible. The thinning moved outward from the entrance like a stone dropped in still water, people stepping aside without deciding to, conversations stopping mid-syllable, a trolley abandoned rolling slowly across the platform because the woman pushing it had simply forgotten to keep pushing. James Potter walked through the gap. He was older than his last photograph, broader through the shoulders, the lines of his face settled into what the boy in those photographs had been growing toward. Lily walked beside him, her hand in the crook of his arm, and if she felt the weight of 200 pairs of eyes, she gave no indication. Sirius and Remus fell into step behind them, with the quiet synchronization of people who had moved through difficult terrain together for a very long time. Harry and Hermione walked beside their parents. They were not wide-eyed, and they were not performing composure. They had been told exactly what this moment would look like, and had chosen independently, and then together, to meet it on their own terms. Harry carried his father's posture without having copied it. The straightness that comes from a decade of being taught that a room is something you enter with intention. Hermione had her mother's stillness. They were holding hands, which they had done since they were 4 and 5, and had never stopped doing when things were significant. The platform went quiet in sections, like lights going out in a large building, room by room, until the whole thing was dark. Molly Weasley dropped a trunk. She didn't notice. They walked the full length of platform 9 3/4, at the pace of people who have somewhere to be and are not afraid of the distance. Sirius wore the focused calm of a man receiving something owed to him for 13 years. Not triumph, just receipt. Remus walked with his hands in his pockets, which was how he always walked when he was paying attention to everything. Halfway down, Arthur Weasley made a sound that was not a word. Percy stopped adjusting his prefect badge mid-motion. The twins stood absolutely still, which was the most alarming thing anyone on that platform had seen in years, because Fred and George Weasley were never still. Harry found Draco Malfoy's face near the engine. Draco was staring with the expression of a boy whose certainties were load-bearing, and who had just felt them shift underfoot. Harry held the look for 3 seconds, without hostility, without performance. Then he looked away. Dumbledore was near the rear of the train, because of course he was present the way he was always present for significant things. Through whatever awareness a man develops over 7 decades of ensuring that important events pass through him on their way to happening. He stood in his traveling robes, half-moon glasses catching the gray September light, watching James Potter approach with the expression of someone solving a very complex equation in real time. He looked at James, then at Harry, then at James again. Something moved across his face in that sequence. Joy, genuine and unperformed, and beneath it the grief of a man who has just seen the decade he could have had instead of the one he got. It lasted 2 seconds, then was managed away with the expertise of a man who had been managing his expressions for a very long time. "James," he said. "Albus," James said. "We'll talk. Not today." They walked past him. Dumbledore stood where he was for a moment after they had gone. Then he turned and watched them continue down the platform, and his expression, in profile, with no one observing it, belonged entirely to himself. McGonagall's face, when Harry Potter and Hermione Potter stepped forward in the Great Hall, performed a sequence of adjustments that any student would have failed to read, and any colleague would have recognized immediately as McGonagall encountering something she had not prepared for. She placed the hat on Harry's head with hands that were entirely steady. 1 heartbeat, Gryffindor, carrying not the tone of discovery but of confirmation, as though the hat were not finding something but acknowledging it. The table erupted. Hermione sat next. The hat settled. 3 seconds, longer than Harry, brief enough to carry its own statement. Then, Gryffindor, with the warmth of something that had been waiting a long time to say a particular word to a particular person. The table erupted again, differently. Ron Weasley, sorted 10 minutes prior and still processing the proximity to history he now occupied, was cheering with his whole body. Harry crossed to the Gryffindor table and stood for a moment before sitting, looking at the floating candles, the enchanted ceiling showing a clear September night, the 1,000-year-old weight of the place, with the expression of someone checking a briefing against a reality and finding the reality larger. He had been told about this room since he was old enough to understand descriptions. Remus had described it. Sirius had described it with considerably more enthusiasm and several exaggerated details that James had gently corrected, and Sirius had defended as being spiritually accurate if not factually so. He had formed a picture of it in his mind over years of second-hand accounts. The reality was larger. The accounts had not been wrong exactly. They had simply failed to capture the feeling of being inside something that had been holding magic in its walls for 1,000 years. The specific quality of a space that was not merely old but layered. Every generation of students who had eaten here and argued here and been frightened here and learned here, leaving something behind, adding to what the room was in ways that no one had ever thought to measure. He found Draco Malfoy at the Slytherin table, already seated, watching with that same eroding certainty from the platform. The framework Lucius had built him was showing its seams in real time, and Harry could see it clearly from across the room. He sat next to Hermione without breaking the look until he chose to. The Gryffindor common room at 11 that night had a specific quiet, fire banked low, portraits sleeping, the stillness of a space designed for company that had been emptied of it. Harry and Hermione had claimed the far corner table, running wandless exercises, a quill moving between them, unhurried, a book summoned and set down and summoned again. Ron Weasley came down the stairs from the dormitory and stopped at the foot of them. He watched the quill move with no hand near it. He had grown up in a magical household. He understood this was possible. He had simply not yet integrated the fact that his new dormitory companions were doing it casually at 11 at night, as though it were as unremarkable as breathing. "You can do that without a wand," he said. "Since we were 7, Hermione said without looking up from her notes. "Both of you?" "Harry, since 6, technically." Harry made the expression he made when she was technically correct, in a way that was slightly unnecessary about it, an expression she had recognized since age 6 and had never once adjusted her behavior in response to. Ron descended the remaining stairs, pulled a chair from another table, and sat. He looked at them for a moment, then he reached into his dressing gown pocket and produced a small, battered wizard's chess set, unfolding it onto the table with the ease of long habit. The White Queen immediately told Ron his opening formation was exposed. He told her he hadn't asked. "Want to play?" he said. "I'll play," Harry said. "I'll observe," Hermione said, which meant she would watch for 6 moves and then be unable to stop herself from noting what was structurally available on the board. which all three of them already understood was simply how this was going to go. Ron moved first. Harry responded. Hermione lasted 6 moves before she pointed out a line that would have resolved the Queen's side in 3. Ron absorbed this with the practiced patience of someone who had decided to find it educational rather than irritating, which was the beginning of something that would define the next 7 years. It was not a dramatic start to a friendship. Just a chess set, unfolded on a table in a quiet common room, and 3 people who had independently concluded the night was too interesting to waste on sleep, finding that the space between them was comfortable. The dungeon smelled of cold stone and something ancient. Potions residue soaked into the walls over centuries. The sharpness of ingredients heated and reduced in this room, longer than the Ministry had existed. Snape moved between the benches, with his robes close and his hands clasped behind his back, and his gaze moved across the room the way a man takes inventory of a space he already owns, until it reached Harry Potter and stopped. The stop lasted less than a second. Whatever it contained, Snape had managed it back into order before anyone without training would have caught it. Harry met the look with attention that was neither defiant nor deferential, which was, to someone accustomed to receiving one or the other, faintly disorienting. Snape directed his first question at the room. The room was silent. He aimed it specifically at Harry, and Harry answered correctly without notes, in the manner of someone for whom the answer was not retrieved but simply present. Snape asked the second question, sharper, designed to find the edge of what the first answer had actually meant. Harry answered that, 1-2. Hermione, beside him, was taking notes on both questions and both answers, for her own purposes, which had nothing to do with needing the information. Draco Malfoy made his mistake 40 minutes in. A comment, low enough that only nearby benches caught it, about Hermione's origins. He used the word his father used. He had heard it used without consequence his entire life. The consequence arrived quietly. Interesting choice, Draco, Harry said at the same volume. My mother researched your family's war record quite thoroughly. All 32 counts. A pause of exactly 1 second. Which one is your family most proud of? The dungeon held the silence of a room in which everyone has suddenly become very interested in their cauldron. Draco said nothing, not because he lacked responses. He had several assembled from a lifetime of his father's dinner-table politics, but he had understood, in the 2 seconds since Harry spoke, that he did not know how much Harry knew, and that uncertainty was more dangerous than anything he could say. A counter-argument requires knowing the terrain. Draco no longer knew the terrain. He returned to his cauldron. The lesson continued. They had identified the threat inside the defense professor's borrowed face by October, not through warnings or tips, but through Harry's patient mapping of the staff's magical signatures, which had produced a wrong-note quality in Quirrell's aura that Hermione's runic analysis identified as the instability of 2 presences occupying one body. They sent a compressed report to the manor in the family cipher. James's reply arrived in 3 words. We'll handle it. Christmas at Potter Manor was the warmth that Hogwarts was the education for. Sirius had put lights on everything, not tastefully, not with any organizing principle, just on everything, the manor blazing against the December dark, like a lighthouse operated by someone who had never received guidance on the concept of restraint. There are lights on the garden gnomes, Hermione said, standing in the entrance hall with her trunk at her feet. I helped, Harry said. They looked terrible. Sirius said that was the point. Sirius was correct, Lily said, and came down the stairs to hold them both. James and Sirius entered the stone's protections late in that spring, at 2 a.m, when the castle had achieved the deep unconsciousness of a student body 3 weeks into examinations. The passage they used was one Sirius had memorized from a map he and James had built 2 decades ago and never shared with the Ministry, because some knowledge was worth keeping. Lily's modified unlocking charm, which asked the lock from the wrong side because the original locked from within, opened the 3rd-floor corridor in 4 seconds. Fluffy went down to a Arcadian sedation melody Remus had found in a 14th-century bestiary. The correct flying key was drawn from the air by a detection charm Remus had built from a lock sample obtained through a house elf who had accepted 6 chocolate frogs and a genuine thank you. McGonagall's chess set fell in 6 moves. James had been Hogwarts champion in his 5th and 6th years, a fact that had produced in Harry and Hermione, when Lily mentioned it in passing, the particular expression of children discovering a parental competence they hadn't accounted for. The Mirror of Erised stood in the final chamber, with the permanent quiet of something that had been exactly what it was for a very long time. James looked into it. Beside his reflection, Lily. Behind them, Harry and Hermione and Sirius and Remus, all together in the arrangement of a family that had survived the unsurvivable and was still, improbably intact. He looked at it for 3 seconds. Then he reached in, the glass giving way for someone who wanted to find rather than to possess, and took the stone from his own reflected pocket. Small, heavy, warm in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. He turned away without looking back. Dumbledore was in his office when they emerged, sitting behind his desk with the expression of a man who has had several hours to prepare his composure. "The boy was never supposed to face this," he said. The boy, Lily said, evenly, was asleep in Gryffindor Tower. The stone was destroyed the following morning. The destruction took 40 seconds and produced a sound like a long note held past its natural end and then released. Dumbledore watched it with the expression of a man setting down something he had been carrying for a very long time. James watched Dumbledore and noted the expression and filed it. They met properly that evening, the first honest conversation either of them attempted, and both knew it. Dumbledore explained the bloodword logic, what Lily's sacrifice, had she died, would have done for Harry through his Aunt Petunia's blood. The protection that would have persisted through Harry's 17th year, the way it would have anchored him to the world of the living. He said it without apology, because he had genuinely believed it, and both of them understood that a man defending something he knows to be wrong apologizes first. "You meant to keep him alive long enough to choose," James said. "Yes, he's had a choice his entire life." James looked at the instruments on Dumbledore's desk, delicate silver things, calibrated over years, spinning in the slow ongoing work of recalibration. "You plan to give him a choice between dying and accepting death. That's not a choice, Albus. That's a trap with 2 exits that lead to the same place." Dumbledore was quiet for a long time. "Yes," he said finally, "it was." The fire in the grate moved. Fawkes on his perch made a small sound that was not quite music. "What do you want from me, James?" Dumbledore asked. Not defensively, the question of a man who has been found wanting and is genuinely trying to understand what repair looks like. James considered the answer with the patience he brought to calculations that mattered. "Be honest with us going forward. Not managed, not strategic. Honest. When you know something that affects my children, you tell us. When you have a plan, you share it. When you don't know something, you say so." "That is a considerable ask," Dumbledore said. "Yes," James said. "It is." The session did not end warmly, but it ended honestly, and in the ledger they were both keeping, that was the only currency that mattered. Lily told no one she was going. Not James, not Sirius, especially not Sirius, who held opinions about Severus Snape that were old and load-bearing and had never been asked to carry anything more nuanced than contempt. Not Remus, who would have wanted to discuss it. She told no one because this was not council business and not a strategic question, and not, if she was being exact about it, a matter in the way that word implied a beginning, a middle, and a resolution. It was simply something she had been not doing for 10 years and had decided, one Tuesday morning watching snow come down on the manor garden, to do. She apparated to Hogsmeade and walked to the castle through Highland December cold that had no interest in being atmospheric, just cold, settled into the joints and staying. The castle was in its end-of-term rhythm. She passed students in the corridors without being noticed. She descended to the dungeons, knocked once. The door opened after a pause that was neither long nor short, but entirely controlled. The beat of a man who has heard something unexpected, and used the available seconds to ensure that whatever he presents is what he intends. Snape opened the door, and the intention lasted approximately half a second. What moved across his face was something she had known would happen, and been unprepared for regardless. The mask dropping with a completeness that changed the quality of the air in the doorway. 10 years of constructed composure, dissolving the way things dissolve when they encounter the one variable they were never built for. He had built his defenses against grief and guilt, and the daily maintenance of a man living inside catastrophic choices. He had not built them against her standing in his doorway in December, looking at him. "Hello, Sev," Lily said. Not an accusation, just her voice, saying the name she had always used. That was worse than any accusation because it held no weapon, nothing to defend against. Just the sound of someone saying his name the way she had said it when they were children walking home from school, and the name had meant nothing except that she was talking to him. He stepped back. She came in. His office was organized with the precision of someone for whom order was a form of control. Ingredients catalogued, texts arranged by subject and then by date within subject, a marking pile in an absolutely even stack. The fire was low. "You were alive," he said finally. "Level, at cost. Yes, for 10 years. Yes." The silence between those words and what came next was the length of a man deciding whether what he felt was anger or what anger was standing in for. "We couldn't tell anyone," she began. "The manor's exposure, I understand the security requirements." He looked somewhere past her. "I was not asking for an explanation. I know. A beat. I'm sorry, Sev." Something moved through his face that he managed before it fully resolved. They covered the decade in 15 minutes. Not enough time, and the only possible amount. "You became a Death Eater," she said. Not angry, not accusatory, the tone of someone who needs to understand the architecture of a thing before she can speak honestly about it. "You know I did. I want you to tell me why. Not the version you've refined, the actual reason." The fire made a small sound. Outside, wind moved against the enchanted windows that showed the sky rather than the dungeon wall, the gray of a December afternoon, real and entirely elsewhere. "Because I was 21 years old," he said finally, "and I was angry at everything I didn't have, and convinced that the people offering what I wanted understood something the rest of the world didn't." He said it without inflection, the texture worn away by years of private examination. "It was not more complicated than that. I have spent considerable effort making it seem so." "The incident in our 5th year," she said. "You said it because part of you believed it." His jaw tightened, the first involuntary thing she had seen from him. "I need you to know I know that," she said. "Not as punishment, as a fact between us." "Yes," he said, one syllable carrying 15 years of an acknowledgement owed with nowhere to pay it. A long silence settled, the kind that sits with its contents rather than trying to resolve them. "And you've been protecting Harry," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Subtle and complete. "I protect all my students." Sev, his hands, clasped on the desk before him, were very still. "Because he is yours," he said. The fire moved, the December light held its gray. "I thought you were dead," he said, "for 10 years. I know, I'm sorry for that. Were you ever going to tell me?" The honest answer was complicated. She gave it to him anyway. He cut through before she finished. "Apologize for the 10 years of grief. Not for the security breach." The sentence landed with the weight of something he had not planned to say. "I'm sorry for the 10 years of grief, Sev," she said. They did not reconcile. She had not come for that, and he was not a man who reconciled in an afternoon in a cold dungeon in December. He changed at geological pace, in the dark, without witnesses. Whatever this conversation moved in him would take months or years to surface. What they reached was something smaller and more durable than reconciliation. "Treat them fairly," she said at the door. "Not warmly, just fairly. The way you'd treat any student who does the work. They do the work," he said. "Not a question. They do nothing but work." Something passed through his expression that was not quite amusement, and not quite respect, but lived in the territory between them. She left. He did not ask her to stay. In the first potions lesson after the holiday, Snape returned their essays. Harry's, outstanding, came back with a single note in Snape's compressed hand. Adequate cross-referencing. See recommended supplementary reading. Ron received it across the table and stared at it. Turned it over. Stared again. "I have been here 3 months. I have never seen him give anyone an outstanding." Harry looked at the note. He recognized, with the literacy of someone taught to read what was underneath what was said, exactly what that grade had cost its author. "It's a start," he said, and put the essay away. The writing appeared on the second-floor corridor wall on a Wednesday night in October, and by Thursday afternoon the castle had decided to be afraid. "The Chamber of Secrets has been opened. Enemies of the heir, beware." Mrs. Norris hung by her tail from a torch bracket, petrified so completely she looked preserved. The words were written in something that had dried to a dark brown which everyone identified immediately, and no one said aloud. Harry and Hermione stood in the gathered crowd and looked at the wall with the expression of people who were not surprised and were carefully not showing it. They had confirmed the diary's destruction years ago. Whatever had opened the chamber had not used the diary, which meant something else had. "The chamber itself," Hermione said that evening, in the corner of the library with the door warded and her notes, open. Not a Horcrux. An architectural residual. Slytherin built everything. The entrance, the passage, the whole mechanism. A man that thorough would have built a dormant activation trigger directly into the stonework. Responding to a parcel mouth in the school, Harry said, "The first in decades. Your presence activated something that had been waiting a very long time." She met his gaze, which means you opened it, without meaning to, which also means you can open it deliberately. A pause. "We do this in front of McGonagall," Harry said, "and Snape and Sprout. Nothing in secret that doesn't need to be." They convened in the second-floor girls' bathroom on a Friday, which smelled of old stone and disused plumbing. Moaning Myrtle watched from her U-bend with the proprietary interest of a ghost who considered this her territory and had not yet decided whether the intrusion warranted complaint. Harry crouched before the sink, and the carved serpent worn almost smooth by centuries. He studied it for a moment. Then he spoke. A sentence in Parseltongue, the hissing arriving in his throat with the naturalness it always had, as familiar as breathing. The sink rotated. The basin revealed the pipe beneath it, wide and dark, descending into the rock below the castle's foundations. McGonagall made a sound, controlled and brief. Snape said nothing. His silence carried the quality of a man whose hypothesis has just been confirmed in the worst possible way. "There's a basilisk inside," Harry said, standing. "Approximately 1,000 years old. I'm going to speak with it." "You are going to do no such," McGonagall began. "I'm the only Parselmouth in this school, Professor." He looked at her steadily. "I'll meet Hermione." Hermione produced a notebook already containing 14 pages of preliminary documentation and explained the acoustic shielding protocol to the assembled staff while Harry climbed into the pipe. 30 minutes, Snape said, "before I come down myself." "More than enough," Harry said. The passage was long and cold, the tunnel leveling at the bottom into a space that had not been touched by human hands in centuries. Shed skins curled against the walls, 20 feet long, 30 translucent and dry, curling like discarded architecture. Hermione counted them. Of course she did. 14 segments visible, she said quietly. Growth rate for basilisks in controlled conditions suggests 60 feet minimum. "I know. I just want the number acknowledged." 60 feet, Harry said. "Acknowledged." Harry spoke at the chamber door in Parseltongue. The stone mouth opened. The chamber beyond was cathedral vast, its ceiling lost in the dark above the wand light, its double rows of serpent columns marching into the distance. The floor was wet. Sound moved through it slowly, deliberately, as though the chamber considered acoustics a matter worth taking seriously. Harry closed his eyes. Hermione positioned herself with her back to a column, measuring distances by sound and air movement. He spoke into the dark. "I am Harry James Potter, heir of Peverell, son of the house that held the cloak. I come to speak with the guardian of this chamber." The silence was not empty, the silence of something enormous and ancient, deciding whether the voice that had spoken was worth answering. Harry had been taught to wait in this kind of silence. He waited. The air changed. The water on the floor rippled outward from a presence that had been still so long its movement was its own seismic event. "The little speaker comes without weapons," said a voice in ancient Parseltongue. Older syntax, older grammar, recognizable but requiring concentration. "I have no weapons that would matter to you," Harry said. "I came to speak, not to fight." The last one who came spoke of the master, commands, instructions. The contempt was structural, built into the grammar itself. "I'm not here to command you." He kept his voice in the register of honest conversation, not submissive, not aggressive. "You've been in this chamber for 1,000 years, alone, waiting for instructions from a man dead for 9 centuries. I want to offer you something different. State your purpose." The negotiation took 22 minutes. Harry offered light and expanded space. The deeper caverns beneath the castle's east wing, structurally available, identified in the surveys Hermione had studied in the library. He offered purpose aligned with original intent, not a weapon aimed at bloodlines, but a guardian. "You were built to protect this school," he said. "You've been protecting an empty room for a century. I'm offering you work that matches what you were made for." A long silence. Consideration, not assessment. A different thing entirely. "The little lord speaks like someone old," the basilisk said finally. Hermione, behind him, very quietly. "Is that a yes?" Harry, in English. "That's a yes." They emerged into the bathroom. 27 minutes after descending, the three professors were exactly where they had been left. "The chamber is under the protection of the sovereign heirs," Harry told them. "The basilisk will relocate to the eastern caverns and function as a guardian, not a weapon. The petrifications will stop." McGonagall absorbed this with the careful deliberateness of someone selecting each word for its load-bearing capacity. "I will require a full written report. By Friday," Hermione said, producing her notebook. Snape looked at Harry. "You negotiated with it. It's the only language it speaks." Several layers of Snape's expression shifted at once. "What did it call you?" Harry considered whether to answer. "The little lord," he said. Snape was quiet. Then, in the careful neutrality of a man filing information he has not yet decided what to do with, "Apt." McGonagall, standing in the girls' bathroom with 14 pages of preliminary documentation in one hand, and the professional composure of a woman who has been surprised by Hogwarts students for 40 years and has developed the infrastructure for it, said, "Miss Potter, I will additionally require your methodology notes." "Section 3, Hermione said. "I anticipated you might." Myrtle, from her U-bend, said that she thought the whole negotiation had been very dramatic and she was very glad she had been there to witness it, and that this was the most interesting thing that had happened in the bathroom since she died. That evening, the Great Hall breathed easily for the first time in months. Students ate dinner with the ease of people who have set down a weight they had been carrying so long they'd stopped noticing it. At the Slytherin table, a different kind of quiet prevailed. Not the house's customary calculated composure, but something more like reckoning. The 1,000-year-old claim that Slytherin's chamber was theirs by blood, their weapon by inheritance, had been replaced in 27 minutes by something that belonged to no house in particular, and to all of them equally. It was a small thing in the scale of what was coming, but small things, placed at the right angle, moved large ones. 3 days into second year, a letter left Wiltshire for Hogwarts. Lucius Malfoy had written it in the implication-dense language of a man who considered directness a social failure, all positioning and inference, the vocabulary of someone who had spent 2 decades ensuring that what he wanted and what he asked for were never exactly the same sentence. The letter did not reach Dumbledore's desk. Sirius had held a redirect on Lucius Malfoy's correspondence for 6 years, renewed every 8 weeks with the punctuality he brought to nothing else in his life, because some maintenance deserved perfection. The letter arrived at Potter Manor, where James read it over breakfast, set it beside his tea, and wrote, "One line in reply. Try again, and we will discuss the diary." The reply arrived at Malfoy Manor the following morning. Lucius read it standing. He placed it in the center of his desk and looked at it for a long time. He did not write a second letter. By third year, Ron Weasley had become something quietly remarkable, not in the way Harry and Hermione were remarkable, differently with its own distinct value. He understood people with the accuracy they understood spells. He read rooms the way they read texts. In the arena of human navigation, knowing when to speak and when to wait, sensing the current beneath a conversation, translating the extraordinary into something the ordinary world could receive. He had a facility that neither of them possessed, and both relied on without always acknowledging it. 3 years of trying to keep up with minds that played chess the way other people breathed had produced in him something he was only beginning to recognize as its own kind of excellence. The goblet of fire arrived in the entrance hall during 4th year, and by the following morning, every student in the castle had walked past it at least once, with the expression of someone deciding whether to want something. It was impressive the way old magic is impressive, not loud, not flashy, simply present with the assurance of something that has been exactly what it is for a very long time, and has no interest in being otherwise. The blue-white flames moved without consuming anything. The air around it was several degrees colder than the surrounding hall. Harry and Hermione stood in front of it between herbology and dinner. "We're entering," Harry said. "Obviously," Hermione said. This was not a conversation. It was the verbal confirmation of a conclusion both had reached independently before breakfast. Hermione had the submission theory by the following morning. She laid it out at the corner library table, Ron listening with the expression of someone who had long since recalibrated his baseline for extraordinary developments. The goblet is a magical arbitrator. It reads intent, not form. The rules specify 1 champion per school, because the tournament's intent is institutional representation. We are not representing a school, we're representing a house. Harry looked at the draft form. The House of Potter. ancient, sovereign, predating Hogwarts by 3 generations on your side, and considerably longer on mine. We submit as a joint sovereign representation. 2 champions, 1 entry, bound together by unified intent. If the goblet reads intent, it should produce both names. Should, Harry said. The theory is sound. The goblet's arbitration framework predates the written rules. Bagman didn't write those rules. The goblet existed before they did. Ron looked between them. And if it only picks one of you, then we deal with that, Harry said. But it won't. They submitted on Sunday evening, dropping the single folded parchment into the flames together, both holding it for 1 beat before releasing. Not planned. Exactly right. Halloween night. The great hall at full attendance, the candles highest, 4 long tables arranged for an event that expected to be observed. Dumbledore reached into the goblet and drew the first name, the champion for Durmstrang, Victor Krum. Krum rose from where he'd been sitting with Karkaroff and walked to the anteroom with the deliberate stride of someone who had expected this. The champion for Beauxbatons, Fleur Delacour. Delacour rose with the composure of someone for whom confirmation of excellence had ceased to surprise. The Hogwarts champion, Cedric Diggory. The Hufflepuff table made a sound with genuine warmth in it, actual pleasure for someone people liked. Diggory's face did the complicated thing faces do when something wanted actually arrives. Dumbledore set the goblet aside. He turned to address the hall. The goblet flared, not blue-white, something deeper, a light with gold in it. The shade of magic doing something it wasn't originally designed to do, and doing it anyway because the logic required it. The hall went entirely still. 2 slips of parchment rose from the flames together, wound around each other in a slow turn, bound by a thread of that same gold light. Dumbledore reached for them with the expression of a man receiving something he did not predict, and choosing to receive it carefully. He read the first slip. The second. He looked up. Harry James Potter, he said, and Hermione Jean Potter. A beat in which the room processed this. Submitted as a joint sovereign representation of the ancient and noble house of Potter. Karkaroff objected first, Madame Maxime second. Bagman said something enthusiastic and uninformed about unprecedented historical moments. Fudge began a procedural objection, got 3 sentences in, remembered who James Potter was, and what 2 Wizengamot seats looked like when they voted in concert. And the objection became a question, the question became a comment, and the comment became silence. The goblet is the arbitrating authority, Dumbledore said. Its decision is final. We have 4 champions. Cedric Diggory was at the fire in the anteroom when they entered. He looked at them with the expression of someone who had just processed one extraordinary development and was being asked to process another. He was fair-minded. The sequence moved visibly across his face. Surprise, recalibration, acceptance. He extended his hand to Harry, then to Hermione. May the best champions win. The false Moody, Polyjuice maintained, the instability in his magical signature visible to anyone trained to read such things, had given himself away by early autumn. Harry had identified the anomaly in his 3rd week. Hermione had noted it in her 2nd. They compared notes, found them matching on every material point, and sent the compiled file to Potter Manor. The council knew what was coming, including the dragons. Hungarian Horntail Anatomy, a 1923 Scandinavian magazoology text. A nerve cluster behind the 3rd neck plate, present in most of the breed, that responded to a targeted sedation charm with complete and immediate effect. Targeting window, approximately 2 inches. At distance, Hermione practiced at Potter Manor during the half-term, using a model Sirius built with the resigned competence of someone who had learned that requests made of him in this family would always be structurally sound and entirely non-negotiable. Harry entered the enclosure from the near end, moved left immediately, stayed outside the chain's arc as the Horntail tracked him. When the dragon committed to a strike, Hermione's sedation charm arrived from the champion's enclosure, wandless, the targeting precise to the degree that 3 weeks of practice against a 2-inch model at 30 yards could make it, and the nerve cluster received it exactly as the text had described. The dragon settled. Harry walked to the nest, picked up the golden egg, walked back. The crowd was silent for 2 full minutes. Then it was not. Victor Krum, in the champion's enclosure, watched the final 30 seconds with the complete attention of someone disassembling a methodology he had not seen before to understand how it was built. The second task was the lake. Hermione had been studying Mermish since their 3rd year, not to fluency, but to the functional level of someone who knows exactly what she intends to use a language for, and has learned precisely that much and no more. She spoke to the merpeople at the lake's edge in the gray February light, before entering the water. 6 minutes of negotiation, while the judges watched from the platform, with the expressions of people for whom no existing framework covered what they were observing. The merpeople released all 4 captives simultaneously. Harry and Hermione surfaced with Ron, Gabrielle Delacour, Cho Chang, and Cedric's partner, all 4 brought up together in a single organized ascent. The judges spent 11 minutes determining how to score it. They awarded maximum points to both champions. Bagman's megaphone explanation clarified nothing. The crowd did not require clarification. Krum found them at dinner that evening, sitting across from them with the directness of someone who has decided to do a thing and sees no value in approaching it indirectly. "The anatomy study for the first task," he said. "How long?" 3 weeks, Hermione said. "For one task, for the application. I'd have learned it regardless." He looked at Harry. "The movement in the enclosure. Who taught you?" "My parents, my godfather." Krum nodded slowly. He was a competitor the way only people who genuinely love a discipline are competitors, not defensive of his position, not threatened by excellence he hadn't produced, but interested in it, wanting to understand how it was assembled. "You will win," he said. "Not concession, assessment." "Not decided yet," Harry said. "The work you have done decides more than the tasks do." He stood with the same economy of movement he had arrived with. "I have trained since I was very young. I have never trained like that." A pause. "It shows." Ron watched him return to the Durmstrang table and looked at the space he had vacated. "He just told you that you're better than him." Victor Krum. "He said the work shows." Hermione said, "That's the same thing." "It's more specific," she said, and returned to her dinner. Ron picked up his fork. He looked at the Durmstrang table, where Krum had resumed his seat and was eating with the same quiet economy of movement with which he did everything. Then he looked at Harry and Hermione, the way they moved through the tournament, not as competitors performing for an audience, but as 2 people doing a job they had been preparing for, with the focused calm of people for whom the preparation had already been the point. He had been friends with them for 3 years. He had watched them do this, take something that was meant to be extraordinary and treat it as an extension of what they were already doing, and he still had not entirely worked out how to describe it to anyone who hadn't seen it. The closest he had come was this: it was not that nothing surprised them. Things surprised them all the time. It was that when things surprised them, they responded by learning rather than reacting. Every obstacle immediately became material. He found, not for the first time, that being around it had made him better. He saw things more clearly than he used to. He understood when to move and when to wait. He read people with an accuracy that had occasionally startled even himself. He was beginning to understand what friendship with people like this actually cost, and actually gave. You either kept up or you stopped growing. And he had decided, somewhere around 2nd year, that he would keep up. The graveyard arrived without transition. One moment the maze, hedges and darkness and the cold of an enclosed space at midnight, and then the Portkeys pole and a different cold entirely. Older, the cold of ground that had been receiving the dead for centuries and understood its purpose. They landed together, upright, hands releasing the cups simultaneously. Portkey arrivals had been drilled at Potter Manor since they were 8, Sirius throwing cheap Portkeys at them in the back garden, until landing without stumbling became pure reflex. Hermione's detection ward was moving within 3 seconds. 9 perimeter positions, she said, voice low. Cauldron northeast, 28 yards. Pettigrew, and something in the cauldron that's almost finished. Harry looked at the cauldron's light above the headstones, red-blue pulsing with the mechanical rhythm of a ritual in its final stage. He felt a pull from the scar on his forehead, not pain, but resonance, the mark left by the blood anchor's shockwave in the nursery, 15 years ago, knowing, in the way that old wounds sometimes know, what had originally made it. "Can we stop it?" he asked. "The ritual wards are too advanced. They need to complete before we can act." A pause. "The council has already signaled." "I know." The cauldron's light went white. James and Lily arrived in the same moment Sirius and Remus did, apparating from 200 yards out, where they had been waiting since the tracking array activated. Sirius had built the array onto both their tournament entry points early in the autumn, renewing it every 8 weeks with the punctuality he brought to nothing else in his life, because some maintenance deserved perfection. James found Harry and Hermione in 3 seconds. The line of his shoulders changed, not with relief, but with the recalibration of a man who has confirmed what he most needed to confirm, and can now think about everything else. Lily built the soul ward from the moment her feet touched the ground. Not visible, not yet. Present the way foundations are present before walls go up, laying itself into the graveyard's air with the certainty of something prepared over years for exactly this moment. The 6 of them formed a line between the older headstones as the Death Eaters came from the perimeter. 8 of them, coordinated, rehearsed for a scenario they had not arrived in. James drove forward with combat transfiguration, turning the graveyard's own architecture against the advancing line. Headstones becoming barriers, the ground becoming an obstacle, the environment active and purposeful in his hands. Sirius moved through the spaces James opened, dueling at a pace the Death Eaters had not trained against. His style stripped of auror convention over 13 years, and therefore impossible to read by anyone who had learned from a ministry handbook. He transformed mid-stride, closed the distance on the nearest Death Eater at full sprint, the impact decisive, and was human again and already casting before the man had finished falling. Remus held the Eastern approach with the comprehensive coverage of someone whose defense methodology left no angle unaddressed. His silver Patronus moved through the graveyard, and the Dementors who had accompanied Voldemort's return found they could not approach it. Lily held the ward and shaped it, not a shield but a pressure system, every dark curse crossing its boundary arriving diminished, its intent partially absorbed, its force reduced to something manageable. She had been building toward this for 15 years. She held it without strain. And Harry faced the figure that had stepped from the cauldron's dark, tall, white, red-eyed, inhabiting a new body that had not yet learned how to move with confidence. "You are dead, James Potter," the voice said, thin, carrying clearly across the graveyard, relearning what a throat was for. "You keep saying that," James said from his position between the headstones, and drove a stunner at the nearest Death Eater without looking away. Harry moved toward Voldemort. Not because the prophecy required it. He had been taught since childhood to treat prophecy as conditional poetry, and to examine those conditions very carefully before acting on them. He moved because Lily needed to be stationary to maintain the ward at full capacity, which meant someone had to occupy Voldemort. And because he was, at 14, faster and more precisely trained than anything Voldemort had prepared for in this body. Voldemort cast. Harry moved, the dodge low and economical, built into his body since before he could articulate how, and answered with a chain of responses that drove Voldemort backward toward the cauldron. Not to win. To occupy. To buy Lily time. Voldemort used his reconstructed wand with the force of a wizard of genuine magnitude, the spells arriving in combinations Harry had to work hard to read. But Harry had been reading combinations since he was 5, and he had been reading this particular combination in Lily's notes and James's briefings and Sirius's intelligence reports for years. He knew the pattern. "You had 6 anchors," Harry said, between deflections, stating, not taunting, "You have none." Something moved across Voldemort's face in the space between one curse and the next, a counting. The count reached its conclusion, and what appeared in those red eyes was something Harry had never expected to see there. Fear. Not the fear of death exactly, the fear of someone who has spent 60 years constructing elaborate defenses against a single thing, and has just realized the thing has found him anyway. "Najin," Voldemort said. "Confirmed last month," Harry said. "The others went years ago. Diary, ring, locket, cup, diadem. We've been working since before I could walk." The silence after that was different from any that had come before it in the graveyard. Voldemort was not finished. He had power and will, and the particular fury of a man whose entire framework for survival has just been removed from beneath him. But fury without architecture is noise, and the architecture was gone. Lily's soul ward reached its full potential. She redirected it, gathering its accumulated force the way a lens gathers light, concentrating years of intent into a single outward pulse directed at the center of the graveyard. Not the mechanism of the blood anchor, which had answered a killing curse with the logic of old constructed magic. Something different. The ward's years of accumulated love. Love as architecture. Love as force. Love as the one thing Tom Riddle had never built a defense against. because he had never understood why it was dangerous, released at once toward the thing that had spent 60 years being afraid of it. He fell, not dramatically, he simply fell, the way things fall when whatever was holding them upright is no longer there, collapsing to the wet ground with the finality of something that has finished. Tom Riddle, born to a Muggle father and a witch mother, orphaned young, brilliant and afraid, dead in a graveyard in June, without his anchors or his followers or his wand or his certainty. In the presence of the family he had tried to destroy, it was over. The graveyard settled into its ordinary quiet, dew on the headstones, the distant sound of wind in the trees beyond the wall. 8 Death Eaters bound or stunned at various points among the graves. Their coordination dissolved the moment the thing coordinating them was gone. Pettigrew, still incarcerated, had stopped making sounds. In the silence that followed, the graveyard was simply a graveyard. Old ground doing what old ground does, receiving and holding, indifferent to the significance of what had just occurred on its surface. James moved through the bound and stunned Death Eaters with systematic thoroughness. Sirius was grinning with the expression of a man receiving what had been owed to him for 13 years. Remus secured the perimeter. Pettigrew made small sounds against the ground, still incarcerated from Harry's first-minute casting, and no one moved to help him. Harry was on his knees, not injured but hollowed out in the way of someone who has used everything they had and is waiting for it to return. Hermione had her hand on his shoulder, her detection ward still active, still reading. "Is it done?" he asked. "It's done," Lily said. He reached up and touched the scar on his forehead, the curved mark the blood anchor's shockwave had left on him in the nursery, 15 years ago, the permanent record of a night that had tried to end everything and ended nothing except itself. No resonance, no pull, no cold pressure from somewhere that ran deeper than memory, just skin, just a scar, just the quiet evidence of a night that had tried to end everything and had ended nothing except itself. He dropped his hand. Hermione was watching him. She had been watching since his fingers went to his forehead, reading his face with the attention she gave things that mattered. "It doesn't hurt," he said. She said nothing. She took his hand, and they stood up together, and they walked out of the graveyard. The 6 of them. The family assembled in a kitchen in the middle of a terrible night, and still building ever since. And behind them, the ordinary quiet of that old ground returned, and the long work was finally completely done. James and Sirius arrived at the ministry on a Tuesday morning in the formal robes of their houses. James in the deep green and gold of the ancient and noble house of Potter, Sirius in the silver and black of the ancient and noble house of Black, and crossed the atrium at the pace of men who had been walking toward a specific room for a very long time and had decided, today, to arrive. The atrium noticed them in sections. A witch near the fountain stopped mid-sentence. 2 wizards from magical transportation recognized James. One grabbed the other's arm, and the recognition spread through the morning crowd, the way it spreads when what is being recognized is something that should not exist. Sirius wore the focused calm of a man receiving what he was owed, not triumph, receipt. They placed 2 documents on the Wisengamot reception desk with the care of things that had been handled for a long time. The reception witch looked at them, looked at James, looked at them again. She picked up her flu connection and said, very quietly, "Minister, I need you to come to the Wisengamot lobby now." Cornelius Fudge entered the lobby and performed within 4 seconds the calculation his entire career had trained him to perform. Who has power? Who wants what? What move costs the least and buys the most time? And found for perhaps the first time that it did not resolve. He said something professionally warm and entirely empty, shook James's hand for the witnesses, and went back to his office to stare at his wall. It was, characteristically, the wrong choice, but it preserved the most options for the longest time, and Cornelius Fudge had built his career on that principle. James took his seat in the Wisengamot chamber at 11. The Potter family seat had been unoccupied for nearly 14 years. Sirius took the Black family seat simultaneously, which produced a wave of individual sounds from the chamber that together amounted to one collective one. Augusta Longbottom, 3 seats to James's left, looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, with the compressed acknowledgement of a woman who does not waste gestures. Amelia Bones, across the chamber, was already reviewing the parchment before her. Her posture had shifted, settled, ready, the look of someone waiting for a particular piece to arrive on the board and now seeing it placed there. James brought his first motion before the chamber had finished processing his presence, a formal audit of all imprisonments conducted in the years immediately following Voldemort's fall, specifically those in which Ministry emergency powers had waived the requirement of trial. Alongside it, a second motion, formal clearing of the charges filed against Sirius Black in absentia, based on the manufactured evidence Peter Pettigrew had planted before fleeing. Sirius had never been physically imprisoned. The Council's disappearance had prevented that, but the charges had stood in the official record for 13 years, and they required the record to answer them. Both motions were read in the language Remus had spent 4 months constructing to be procedurally impossible to block. Both passed. The audit found 43 people in the official record who had faced the Ministry's processes without trial. 31 were still incarcerated. The names of the officials who had signed the original non-trial orders were read into the record. 2 of those officials were in the chamber that day. They did not look at Sirius. He did not look at them. He looked at the vaulted ceiling of a room that had held his name in its files for 13 years, with an expression that did not require a name. The Umbridge file arrived the following year, 100 pages assembled over years. James's 40 and Sirius's 60, presented on a Monday morning as something designed to be undeniable. Discriminatory legislation drafted with the specific intent of ensuring unemployability. Regulatory rulings fabricated to target individuals who had publicly disagreed with ministry positions. One confirmed instance of illegal Dementor deployment against a private citizen, verified by 3 independent legilimency practitioners. Amelia Bones presented the removal motion without editorializing. 31 for, 17 against. James noted the 17. The office Dolores Umbridge vacated that Wednesday was pink in the way of a territorial claim, rather than a decorative choice. 2 ministry officials arrived with boxes. She was there when they arrived and did not speak while they packed. The plates of kittens came down from the walls and were wrapped in brown paper, stacked with the impersonal efficiency of people doing a job. The room was gray underneath. It had always been gray underneath. She left at mid-morning, carrying 1 box herself, and the corridor outside was occupied only by people who had places to be. No one watched her go. That was its own verdict. At the end of that first session, Cornelius Fudge submitted his resignation on grounds of health. The chamber accepted it without a counter-motion, which was the quietest possible verdict on a 20-year career. Amelia Bones was appointed interim minister by a vote of 41-7. The 7 were noted. The reforms that followed took years. They were not clean or linear or free of resistance. The people who had benefited from the old architecture did not relinquish it gracefully, and the new architecture had to be built while the old one was still partially standing, which is the way all real change happens. But the evidence was on the table, and the Wizengamot, given the choice between acting on it and explaining to the British wizarding public why they hadn't, acted on it. The anti-werewolf legislation Umbridge had drafted was repealed within 6 months. The Ministry's emergency powers statutes were revised to require judicial review. 63 families with members removed from positions or imprisoned on fabricated evidence received formal acknowledgement. It was not enough on its own. It was, James had learned over 13 years, what enough actually looked like. The beginning of something, not the thing itself. James testified before the Independent Commission later that same year. A commissioner whose own parents had died in the First War asked why they hadn't surfaced sooner. Because we didn't want to win a fight, he said. We wanted to end one. A fight you win sends people away still knowing how to fight. An ending removes that. We needed to be certain that when we came back, there was nothing left to come back to. No anchors, no network, no ministry in his pocket, nothing to rebuild from. Did it work? The commissioner asked. James looked at the commission chamber, the faces doing the slow, unglamorous work of building something designed to outlast the people building it. Ask me in 50 years, he said. Hogwarts in 6th year had the quality of a place that has set down something heavy and is learning what it feels like to stand without that weight. Draco Malfoy had spent 2 years becoming someone his father had not designed him to be. It happened the way geological things happen, under pressure, without visible evidence, until the surface finally showed what had been occurring beneath it for years. The certainties Lucius had built were not designed to hold what Draco had witnessed since first year. The chamber resolution, the graveyard's outcome arriving at breakfast, the ministry reforms reaching even into Malfoy Manor. His father's letters had been arriving with instructions already obsolete by the time they landed. In November of their 6th year, Draco appeared at the Gryffindor table during breakfast and placed a sealed envelope in front of Harry without preamble. "My father kept records of everything," Draco said. "He was careful that way. I found a copy in his study during half-term." He pushed the envelope across the table. "I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because the record should be accurate." He stood and left before anyone could respond. The envelope contained Lucius Malfoy's detailed accounting of the network's internal structure. Names, communications, financial arrangements, chains of instruction that predated Voldemort's fall and had been maintained through the years of his absence. 37 names the Ministry's official accounting had missed. Harry held it for a moment. Then he looked at Hermione. "We were wrong about him," he said. "No," she said. "We were accurate about who he was. He changed." "Is there a difference?" "The most important kind," she said. They sent the envelope to Amelia Bones that afternoon. The following week in the library, Draco was working through a potions problem that had resisted 3 attempts. Hermione sat 2 seats away and opened her own work. Neither acknowledged the other. 40 minutes later, without looking up, Draco said, "The 3rd step. You're inverting the reduction sequence." Hermione checked his parchment, then hers. "That's correct." He nodded and returned to his work. This was not reconciliation, and it was not friendship. It was 2 people sharing a space without the old hostility between them. A smaller thing than either of those, more honest, which both of them recognized for exactly what it was, and nothing more. Sirius Black spent his 40s making up for lost time with the comprehensive commitment he brought to everything he decided mattered. The Marauder Foundation opened in Diagon Alley, funded by the Black estate, staffed with people Sirius had spent 6 months selecting with the care of someone who understood that work was only as good as the people doing it. It served magical orphans and children of imprisoned or missing parents, the population that had fallen through every gap in the wizarding welfare system, which were numerous, and had been deliberately unaddressed for decades. The reception area had navy walls and a large portrait of a stag above the front desk, painted by an Edinburgh artist Sirius had commissioned and paid considerably above the quoted rate, because the result was exactly right. Remus published his lore research that same season, 8 years of work in 4 volumes, presented to the magical academic community. Reviews arrived from 6 publications simultaneously, written with the bewildered reverence of a field encountering work several years beyond what they believed currently possible. He read them at the Potter Manor kitchen table on a Saturday morning with Tonks sitting across from him, her hair cycling between colors because she claimed it helped her concentrate. He taught Defense Against the Dark Arts from the following September, with the employment restriction on lycanthropy formally repealed as part of the Foundations Act reform package. His classes were immediately and permanently oversubscribed. He taught the way he had always taught, with patience, with genuine interest in the capabilities of each student, with the comprehensive knowledge of someone who had spent his adult life learning not what he was supposed to know, but what he actually needed to. He had a gift for finding what each student was afraid of and teaching them to be less afraid of it, which turned out to be the thing most of them needed and the thing most defense teachers had never thought to provide. They had gotten together in the autumn, which surprised no one who had been paying attention, and considerably surprised Remus, who had spent 3 years convincing himself not to. Tonks had resolved this by the simple method of telling him directly what she thought, and waiting to see what he did about it, which turned out to be the only approach that could have worked. Potter Manor, on a summer evening at the end of 6th year, held the warmth produced not by temperature, but by the number of people present who were glad to be there. The Weasleys occupied the garden in the comprehensive way of a large family that has never been inhibited about taking up space. Sirius had put lights on everything again, on the gnomes, on the garden walls, on the rose arbor that had no business being illuminated and was now the brightest thing for half a mile. Remus and Tonks were in the corner with the best view of the sky, easy with each other in the way of people who have recently stopped pretending they aren't. Neville was there with Frank and Alice beside him, still in the early cautious stages of recovery, still tentative with crowds, but present and recognizing their son's face when he crossed the garden toward them, which was everything. Luna had sent a postcard from Peru. She was following a creature 3 separate Peruvian ministry officials had documented, and that she had identified, from their descriptions, as something the literature had not yet named. The postcard was pinned to the manor kitchen notice board, between a photograph of the 6 of them in the graveyard's aftermath and a drawing Harry had made at 9 of the stag Patronus, that Lily had kept without announcing she was keeping it. Harry and Hermione were on the roof. They had been coming to the roof since they were 8 and 9, Harry finding the East Wing's attic access first and showing Hermione 3 days later, because there had never been a question of not showing her. She had a book, she was always reading, and this had never changed, and Harry had never wanted it to change. He was watching the sky with the patient attention of someone looking for nothing particular, and therefore seeing everything. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That we did okay." She looked up from the book, at him, at the sky, the stars coming through the last of the evening light, the manor's grounds below them carrying the noise of people they loved, upward through the warm air. "We did better than okay," she said. "Yeah." A beat that carried the texture of someone settling into a conclusion approached from a very long distance. "But okay is enough for tonight." She closed the book. They sat in the warm dark and watched the stars come fully out, and below them the garden held its warmth and its people, and the manor held all of it the way it had held everything for 2 centuries, without drama, without announcement, with the deep reliability of something built to last. Below them, Ron was losing a game of wizard's chess to George Weasley, and arguing about it with the focused passion of someone who considered being outplayed a temporary condition rather than a verdict. Fred had found Sirius, and the two of them were doing something inadvisable to the garden gnome lights that Lily had not yet noticed. Neville sat with his parents in the corner by the rose arbor, Frank's hand on his shoulder, Alice laughing at something quietly, and the sound of that laughter crossed the garden and reached the roof, and Harry heard it and sat with it for a moment without saying anything. Hermione heard it too. She looked up from her book. "Your mum's research," she said. "Yeah." Harry said nothing else needed saying about that. The stars came fully out above them, and the Milky Way resolved in its long arc across the summer dark, and Harry thought about the nursery on the 2nd floor with the east-facing window, the one that caught the morning, where a mobile of golden snitches still turned slowly in the air, patient and bright, catching whatever light was available. His parents had kept that nursery exactly as it was. He had asked his mother once why they hadn't changed it into something else when they no longer needed it. She had looked at him with the expression she wore when an answer was obvious to her, and she was deciding how to say it. "Because things that are ready," she said, "should stay ready." He had been 11 when she said it. He was only now, at 16 on a rooftop, in the warm dark, with his sister beside him and every person he loved somewhere within earshot below, beginning to understand what she had meant. Above them, the sky was open and clear, and entirely improbably theirs. "Let us know what you'd like to see next." The end.